Biological War, the new book from the author who predicted nuclear war. What happens in the first 72 hours after a bioweapon gets released into a major city? A best-selling author who once mapped out exactly how a nuclear war unfolds minute by minute just turned that same terrifying lens on something even harder to see coming. Stick around, because the scenario she lays out is closer to reality than anyone wants to admit. Annie Jacobsen just released Biological War, a scenario following up her bestseller Nuclear War. A scenario with a ticking clock look at what a real bioweapon attack would actually look like. So why does an author already known for nuclear doom suddenly pivot to germs? Jacobsen spent years reporting on nuclear weapons, government secrecy, and defense programs before writing Nuclear War, a book that turned a dry, technical subject into a page-turning countdown readers could not put down. That book became an international bestseller precisely because it made an abstract threat feel immediate, minute by minute, decision by decision. So the real question is, can she pull off that same trick with something invisible? Her track record suggests she can. Nuclear War sold hundreds of thousands of copies and earned recognition from major outlets specifically because Jacobsen refused to let the subject stay abstract. She named the exact minutes, the exact decisions, the exact rooms where choices would get made. That level of specificity is rare in nonfiction, built around a hypothetical, and it is exactly the skill she now turns toward biological threats. Biological War attempts exactly that. The book walks through a scenario built from dozens of new interviews with people who actually hold political, medical, and military responsibility for handling a crisis like this: a lab accident, a bioattack, a pandemic spinning out of control. Jacobsen traces the hours and days after release, showing exactly how fast infrastructure built to handle a crisis this size could buckle under the weight of it. Here's where it gets genuinely unsettling. What makes a biological attack scarier than a nuclear one? Jacobsen's own framing answers that directly. There is no mushroom cloud, no blast, no shockwave, nothing visible warning people to run. A nuclear weapon announces itself instantly. A biological weapon spreads quietly, person to person, for days before anyone even realizes something has gone wrong, which means by the time officials respond, the damage is already loose in the population. That quiet spread is exactly why the book reads like a thriller instead of a policy report. Jacobsen built her reputation writing exactly this way, turning classified-level detail into scenes readers can actually picture. Biological War keeps that same ticking clock structure, following the invisible countdown from outbreak to what she describes as total societal breakdown, mass death, and a plague-ravaged world that stops resembling anything familiar. So is this fear-mongering, or is it grounded in something real? The interviews behind the book suggest the latter. Jacobsen spoke with people who carry actual responsibility for handling exactly this kind of crisis, giving the scenario a foundation in real expertise rather than speculation. That distinction matters. A scary story is easy to dismiss. A scenario built from the people who would actually be making the decisions is much harder to shake off. That credibility is really what separates this book from typical doomsday fiction. Anyone can imagine a pandemic spiraling out of control. Far fewer writers can walk readers through the actual chain of decisions. Who gets notified first? Which agencies scramble? How fast supply? Chains for vaccines and protective equipment actually move once demand spikes overnight. Jacobsen's reporting background means the book reads less like a nightmare somebody dreamed up and more like a briefing document dressed in narrative clothing. That briefing document quality extends to the smaller, more mundane details too, the ones most thriller writers would skip entirely because they lack dramatic punch on their own. Jacobsen reportedly spends real time on the bureaucratic friction that slows down an emergency response. competing jurisdictions, unclear chains of command, agencies that technically have overlapping authority, but no clear process for deciding who actually calls the shots once a crisis is already underway. Those unglamorous details are exactly what make the scenario feel disturbingly plausible rather than cinematic. Biological war arrives at a moment when global health infrastructure has already been tested hard by recent years, and public trust in that infrastructure has taken real damage. A book like this lands differently now than it might have a decade ago, landing on readers who already have a felt sense of how fast a health crisis can spiral once it starts moving through a population. That lived experience changes how a book like this actually reads. A decade ago, a scenario describing hospitals overwhelmed, supply chains breaking down, and public trust eroding in real time would have felt like pure speculation to most readers. Today, those same descriptions land as recognition rather than invention, since millions of readers already watched pieces of exactly this kind of breakdown play out in their own lives within recent memory. Jacobsen is not asking readers to imagine something entirely foreign. She is asking them to imagine a familiar kind of crisis, scaled up and deliberately triggered rather than naturally occurring. That distinction, deliberate versus natural, is where the book finds its sharpest edge. A naturally occurring outbreak, however devastating, unfolds according to biology alone. No intent behind it, no target chosen. A deliberate biological attack adds a human decision into the mix, someone choosing where, when, and against whom to release something engineered specifically to spread and to harm. Jacobsen's reporting background means she does not shy away from walking through exactly how that kind of decision gets made and by whom, drawing on sources who have spent careers thinking about precisely this scenario from the inside. For readers who tore through nuclear war, this new book offers the same addictive structure applied to a threat that gets far less public attention despite arguably being easier to actually pull off. Nuclear weapons require enormous infrastructure, expertise, and resources that few actors on Earth actually possess. A biological weapon in the wrong hands requires far less to cause chaos at a massive scale. That accessibility gap is not just a talking point Jacobsen raises once and moves past. It shapes the entire structure of the book, returning again and again to the uncomfortable reality that the barrier to entry for this kind of attack keeps shrinking as biotechnology becomes more widely available, more affordable, and more distributed across research institutions worldwide. What once required a nation-state's resources increasingly requires only knowledge, access, and intent, a combination that is far harder to monitor and far easier to underestimate than a nuclear program's visible, trackable infrastructure. That gap in required resources is worth sitting with for a moment. Building a nuclear weapon demands rare materials, specialized facilities, and expertise that stays locked behind national programs and decades of oversight. The building blocks behind a dangerous biological agent are, by comparison, far more accessible, hiding inside labs and research facilities that exist for entirely legitimate purposes. Jacobsen's book leans directly into that uncomfortable gap, and it is part of why the scenario feels less like fiction and more like a countdown already quietly running. That asymmetry is the real gut punch buried inside this book. Nuclear weapons get treaties, inspections, and constant international monitoring, precisely because the world already recognizes how catastrophic they would be. Biological threats have historically received a fraction of that same institutional attention, even though the barrier to causing mass harm keeps getting lower every year biotechnology advances. The threat that gets less attention might be the one closer to happening. Drop a comment on whether you'd rather live through the scenario in nuclear war or biological war. Subscribe for more book breakdowns that actually matter, and share this with anyone who loved nuclear war and has no idea this follow-up just dropped.